Please don't forget to subscribe. My wife, Cassandra, and I have lived in this house on George Street for the past 4 years. We were prepared for the fact that it needed some work upon purchase. You can't expect much more variety in today's market, can you? It was our first shared residence, but it was special nonetheless. Our very first permanent residence. It may have been the pits and I would have thought of it as a mansion. As soon as we got in, we began fixing things. We had to repair the windows, renovate the bathrooms and the kitchen, and update the flooring in some areas. Getting into the basement wasn't exactly high on my list of priorities. I planned to do it when we had more resources available. The basement was mostly used as a storage area during the time. All the moving boxes we didn't want to unpack or seasonal items were stored there. Things include patio furniture cushions, a gazebo's canopy, and festive seasonal decorations. There was a time when finishing the basement and turning it into a recreation room with a small storage area off to the side was high on my to-do list, but as life progressed, that goal fell farther and further behind. After learning of Cassandra's pregnancy, I shifted my attention to the upcoming arrival into my regular 9-to-5, with the goal of ensuring that we were both healthy financially. After finishing the major modifications, we slowed down on the rest. I've been saving a little portion of each paycheck for the basement, but I haven't given it much thought until recently, when I realized I'd already blown past my savings goal a few months ago. Our son Sean is getting older, so I felt it was time to finish the basement now that I had the money for it. This prompted me to act accordingly. I erected new partitions to divide the basement into many rooms. There was a living room, an office, a bedroom for Sean, and a storage room. Everything went together perfectly, and I moved on to laying the flooring. When I found out about the sinkhole, I was almost finished with the living room and was bringing furniture down to the basement. When the ground gave way, my friend Brian and I were in the midst of shifting the furniture. After placing one couch in the middle of the room, we turned our backs for a mere 2 seconds. When we looked back, the couch had already dug its way through the wood flooring I'd laid. Brian and I stopped what we were doing to stare at it in shock before we realized what was happening. We separated and I sprinted to the upper floor to alert my family and phone the fire department. Happily, our efforts were rewarded. A small sinkhole had opened up. It was probably no more than 4 or 5 feet across, and the rest of the house was okay. However, I have no idea how I could have possibly overlooked it. Surely there would have been a sign indicating danger? Perhaps there was a warning that the concrete was shaky? Like, what if I was standing on it and it suddenly collapsed? Or even worse, with just Tina or Sean standing on it. After that, we stayed in a motel for a few days until it was determined that we could return home safely. Apparently it was only affecting a localized region beneath the basement level. There was miraculously no damage to the rest of the foundation. I was informed that so long as I got it handled immediately, we should be good. That was fantastic news in my book. Really, this is every homeowner's worst nightmare. Still, you can't say that at least it wasn't worse than discovering your home was uninhabitable. To fill it in, I contracted an outsider. He was a friend of the family, so I had faith that he would do a good job at a reasonable price. He was booked quite solid through end of July/early August. Even though it wasn't ideal, I decided to wait until I could get him in before fixing the huge hole in my basement. So, I put a sheet of plywood over it and instructed my kid not to go downstairs until my person could fix it. A week after the sinkhole had appeared, Brian and his family came over for dinner. As we were barbecuing in the backyard, conversation naturally ensued. I imagine his kids thought they'd be permitted to go down into the sinkhole after repeatedly begging to view it. Right, kids? Neither one of us was going to intentionally send his children into the sinkhole, but I can see how their inquiries would have piqued his interest. He wanted to go in and snap pictures to show his kids, so I told him it was probably just dirt. The longer it went on, the more I realized that I might as well give in and allow him. While we're at it, maybe we can remove my couch as well. It was an okay sofa, I guess. I was trying to avoid dropping it if at all possible. So, Brian and I dismantled the plywood floor covering downstairs. Sinkhole's depth didn't seem too concerning. Perhaps 6 or 8. You shouldn't go down there if there is no escape, but we were confident we could find one. I retrieved a ladder from the storage area and had Brian descend it first. I figured that if we tied a rope to the couch, we could push and pull it back up if we worked together. I tossed the rope to Brian as he descended the ladder, but when I looked down, he was standing in the middle of the pit, staring around in wonder. He insisted that I personally witness this phenomenon by coming to check it out. Not right now, I don't need the couch. To find out what had caught Brian's attention in such a dramatic fashion, I downed the ladder. Indeed, he was correct. I just had to witness it firsthand. Some photographs of sinkholes have appeared on the internet, and I've seen them. Rather than polished stone blocks, the walls are typically formed of earth. Pictures are not normally found in sinkholes. Brian had pulled out his phone's flashlight and was illuminating the old masonry. Someone had painted rudimentary representations of individuals, nothing more than stick figures, in some form of faded paint or dye. Apparently everyone in the picture was fleeing from something. A lone red man. Brian remarked, "That's some scary looking shit, right?" Before going any further into the pit, which was much longer than I had anticipated. To be honest, the longer I stared at it, the more I saw a tunnel in its structure. I turned around to face the opening in the ceiling again. The ceiling was constructed from chiseled smooth stones, although some of them appeared to have crumbled away at the hole's borders. Their shattered pieces littered the floor beneath my couch. The floor of my basement would have been exposed when they eventually came free and collapsed. A sinkhole this was not. Now this was a whole other ballgame. With his flashlight, Brian continued to study the murals on the masonry. The red man was typically seen assaulting, towering over, and presumably tearing at the victims. Using my own light source, I looked down the tunnel for an exit. I looked in one way, and there was nothing but blackness as far as the eye could see. I had no idea how deep that went. However, I noticed what appeared to be a conclusion when I turned around. The same thing was visible to Brian. We slowly down the tunnel till the light at the end became visible. As we got closer, I could make out that it was a stone door in front of us. Long ago, it was probably a vibrant shade of crimson. However, save from a select few spots, the paint had worn off. Brian arrived first and snapped some pictures on his phone. If memory serves, he may have even filmed it. I tried to open the door while he was doing it. Even with Brian's assistance, I was unable to move it because of how heavy it was. The thing was simply too heavy to carry around. It baffles me how someone managed to get in there. A couple more photos were taken before we turned around and headed home. Brian was eager to investigate the tunnel's opposite end, so we ventured inside for a short while. After only 6 or 7 minutes of walking, we came across a piece of the tunnel that had collapsed in on itself, and I managed to persuade him that it wasn't a good idea to stay there. We re-plywooded the hole in my basement after climbing back down the ladder. When we returned to the upper level, we couldn't stop discussing what we just witnessed. The event clearly had a tremendous impact on Brian's children. I tried to ignore my uneasiness, but it persisted. Everything about that location had seemed so implausible. If you're not from around here, you might not realize that we used to reside just outside of Toronto, Canada. As my wife and I deliberated our next course of action, I showed her some of the photos we'd taken earlier. We were both confused by your discovery of ancient artifacts in your cellar. Yet, we were aware that we needed to make a phone call. We followed up with an email to a Dr. Avery Richards at the University of Toronto. He taught in one of the departments that dealt with anthropology. We hoped he could help us make sense of whatever it was we were staring at, and by the next morning, Dr. Kelly had responded to our email. Say, Cassandra, and Pedro. I appreciate your taking the time to contact me about this. You have definitely uncovered a fascinating find. I can't tell who abandoned these structures or why from the pictures you've provided so far. If it's at all possible, I'd really like to have a closer look at this. Seeing this tunnel in person would be great, but I have a really full schedule till this weekend. Is there any chance I could take a peek on either Saturday or Sunday? I'd like to take some photos of it before you have to put the lid back on. Sincerely, Avery. It's fine with me if we meet on Saturday, so I told him that. After that, the rest of the week went on rather normally. Obviously, I filled Brian in on the situation. He seemed like the type who would want to tag around while Dr. Kelly inspected the premises. It appeared that Cassandra just wanted to get everything over with, and I couldn't say that I blamed her. We both avoided the basement like the plague. Maybe it was simply my overactive imagination, but I didn't feel comfortable being alone myself in that abyss. This may sound ridiculous, but I kept picturing that if I trod on certain locations on the basement floor at the proper time, new holes would open up in the ceiling where the stones had fallen. For my own safety, I preferred to spend as little time as possible in the basement until the area under my house could be completely filled in. However, as I began to hear sounds coming from below, I felt obligated to look into it. When I first encountered them, it was well past midnight. It was just past midnight when I woke up from an early night's sleep. When I found myself unable to fall back to sleep, I got up to drink some water and watch some TV. I had just finished making myself a drink and was considering whether or not to reheat some leftovers in the microwave when I heard it. A barely audible scraping from deep within the home, akin to the manner in which an animal might roam. I had paused for the sake of listening. It was at first difficult to pinpoint the source, but I knew it was somewhere inside the house. This was an absolute necessity. I had looked in the kitchen, the bathroom, the backyard, and the living room. Nothing. In the kitchen, at the entrance to the basement, the noise was the loudest. The thought of the sinkhole prompted me to open the door and take a listen. More and more audible scratching reached my ears. The sound was almost certainly emanating from below. I cautiously started walking down the stairs, but stopped on the last one due to my, obviously irrational, worry that the floor might suddenly give way and crush me. Even though there were no lights on in the basement, I could still make out the scratching. The plywood I'd used to cover the gap in the floor was visible in the dim light coming from the kitchen. There was rumbling underneath it. It sounds like something is scraping against the stone walls below. I fixed my gaze on it, narrowing my eyes as I listened to it scurrying around. This scraping sound was intermittent. In any case, it existed. There was a presence in the bowels. Perhaps it's an animal? To assume there were rats or raccoons in the basement was not an irrational assumption. I wasn't very knowledgeable about animals, but I was sure that whatever was underground sounded much larger than it actually was. However, if there were something so large, Brian and I would have surely spotted it. Having studied the plywood for a while, I decided to add some more support for safety's sake. I switched on the lights and walked carefully over the slippery basement floor for a few minutes as I dragged over some of the items we'd already brought down to weigh down the plywood's edges. As soon as it heard me move, the scratching noise in the tube below stopped. I thought I had scared it away, or at least distracted it. The basement lights stayed on until I was certain that a troop of raccoons wasn't about to storm my home through the plywood. I had just reclosed the door when I heard the familiar scratching sound. It had a little different tone this time around. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn that it sounded like something was scratching at the board itself this time. The next day, I informed Cassandra about the scratching sounds I'd heard and how we'd have to have someone capture or kill whatever was down there before we could fill it in. Due to the additional cost, she wasn't overjoyed by the news. At least she had some idea what was going on. Several more times during the course of the week, I heard scratching coming from the tunnel in the basement. At times, I'd even hear it during the day, but we never gave it any consideration. A Saturday arrived, and with it, Dr. Kelly. About 50 or 60 years old, with horn-rimmed glasses, short gray hair, and a hard face. When he arrived, we were sitting there explaining how we'd found the tunnel, and he greeted us with friendliness. While we were talking, I noticed that he was taking notes on a small notepad. He waited a while and then inquired if he could see the tunnel, to which I replied in the affirmative. Together with Brian, I took him down to the basement and removed the objects I'd been using to weigh down the plywood. It was merely a friendly warning, but I had informed Dr. Kelly that I had heard movement inside and was concerned that rats or whatever might be down there. After removing the plywood, Brian retrieved the ladder we'd used the day before, and we lowered it into the tunnel. First, I climbed down, then Dr. Kelly, And finally Brian. To supplement the illumination provided by our phones, we brought lanterns into the grotto. The polished stone walls reflected the light beautifully. Dr. Kelly's expression of awe upon first seeing it is illustrative of the reaction of many people. He seemed to be fixing his gaze upon something divine. I got the sense that he wasn't quite convinced by what we'd discovered. But now that he was experiencing it himself, he had no doubts. During the first few minutes, Dr. Kelly walked around the room, taking images and video of the deteriorating artwork on the walls with a portable camera and recorder. Brian questioned him, "Do you know what this is?" At one point, Dr. Kelly had reflected his gaze and admitted to us that he was still uncertain. He claims that the wall stonework is consistent with that of another society whose ruins they have discovered. It was something like Prehydrian, if I recall well. Despite this, he found it hard to reconcile the fading paintings with what he had seen in other sites. Besides what I just mentioned, he also remarked a few other things that largely escaped my memory. We waited a while and then volunteered to show him the massive stone entrance we discovered, which Dr. Kelly had warmly encouraged us to explore. Brian had grabbed a lantern and was making his way down the tunnel to the door we discovered. I assumed it would remain standing where we left it, unmoved by our arrival. There was nothing we could use to try and pry the door open with that we had brought with us. While Brian appeared curious about what lay beyond, I couldn't have cared less about finding out. I felt Dr. Kelly could just open it himself if he was that interested. I figured he and his people would find another way to enter the tunnel without having to dig through my basement, and that I could seal off the entrance to my basement without interfering with his plans. This time, though, the door was already open when we arrived. Not completely disregarded as a possibility. There was just one of the stone doors that had been shifted and shoved to the side, allowing something or someone to squeeze in. It wasn't like that when we left, though. Brian and I looked on uneasily as Dr. Kelly gushed about the stonework. Something was very wrong, and we both knew it. When we were last down there, I reported to Dr. Kelly that the door had been closed, but he didn't seem too concerned about it. I don't think he believed us or didn't think we were messing with him. A bit further open, I saw him grab the door and began to press on it. With a little of work, he managed to get one of the doors to open wide enough for all three of us to step through, which was further than Brian and I had gotten it. He entered first, and Brian followed a few seconds later. So, I decided to stay in the background. Before, I didn't give a hoot about what was inside, and I still wasn't sure I did after. However, they did not need to break in because they were already inside. Moreover, it didn't take long for my curiosity to peak. Inside, I followed Dr. Kelly and Brian while holding up one of the lanterns. I can't say what I was anticipating. However, a mausoleum was the last thing on my mind. The building here didn't appear to have received as much care as the tunnel outside. It resembled what I had hoped to find in this area below ground, if anything. The cave was made of stone, and it included numerous chambers with protruding stalagmites and stalactites. As soon as I went inside, my sneakers scraped on the strewn bones. When I looked at the ground, I saw that it was completely swathed in them. It's possible that some of them were nothing more than animal remains. Some of them, at least. But it was very evident that a sizable percentage of them weren't. A human skull lay shattered just feet away from me. And ahead, close to where Brian was standing, I spotted a mostly intact human skeleton. The dead had to be quite old. Aside from dust, the bones were essentially non-existent. However, that did not make me feel any less uneasy. Not alone were bones involved, but so were the living. I looked up and saw other people huddled against the walls. I had a feeling they were once human. Even though their skin was so parched that it hardly registered as skin anymore. I was able to make out each of their features on most of their faces, which were still legible. Some of them still had lips and noses in between the sunken, hollow eyes and protruding teeth. For some, the face was merely a skull. However, they did share a similar characteristic. They all appeared to have been screaming for quite some time. In one corner, the mummified body was hunched up, covering its face with its hands. Another was leaning against the wall, its jaws agape. When they yelled, you could still make out the shape of their compressed eyelids. The next person I saw was Brian, so I glanced him over. His face had lost all of its color. I looked over to see him fixated on one of the mummified bodies, and he looked like he might throw up. Fascinating. Dr. Kelly was speaking, and I overheard him. There's more than one way to put it, but that sums it up nicely. As previously, he acted like a kid in a candy store as he videotaped and photographed everything. Meanwhile, I could hardly take what I was seeing in my eyes. It made me feel sick to my stomach. Sadly, I had to leave. I hadn't even gone very far into the tomb before I decided to turn around. When I departed, Dr. Kelly was investigating one of the offshoots. The sound of Brian's approach reassured me that he was coming to see how I was doing. I promised him I will be returning to the surface soon. He promised to find Dr. Kelly so we could return together. As I saw him disappear back into the cave, I turned my attention elsewhere, peering down the passageway. Ahead of me, through the gap in the ceiling, was a faint glow. Actually, it wasn't too far away. It would only take me a few minutes to get back up to my apartment, and then I wouldn't have to come back down ever again. Dr. Kelly was invited to investigate this nightmare as much as he liked. In any case, I was sure I saw something looking back at me as I peered down the tube. The dim lighting made it difficult to determine. But I thought I saw a face peering at me from the shadows next to one of the walls. A human face. Maybe? The only problem was that it was a bit too red and gaunt to be appealing. In an effort to focus my vision, I blinked and squinted. Nonetheless, my attempts at concentration resulted in its disappearance. I turned my head toward the cave exit so that I could urge Brian to hasten our departure. And just as I was about to do so, I heard the sound of the ladder we had placed at the cave entrance crashing to the ground. The last time I checked, it had fallen on the floor. For a few seconds, I just looked at it. That ladder had no business toppling over. There hadn't been enough room for it to topple over. Brian and Dr. Kelly appeared from the cave nearly on cue. It seems that they both witnessed the same thing as I did. The strewn ladder. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way in its direction. It took Brian and I a minute to raise it, and then I was the one to get out. Noticing my basement, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary at first. For a second, I thought perhaps something had dashed into the ladder and knocked it over. Obviously, something had once called the place home. Before continuing on to the upper levels, I turned around to help Brian and Dr. Kelly out of the elevator. And then we were standing in my kitchen, and my eyes first caught the blood at that very moment. The sensation of my heart racing and my blood turning cold is one I will never forget. The dark red blood smeared the otherwise pristine tile floor. I called out for Cassandra and then Sean. There is silence. Brian was trying to get his own wife's attention. He yelled for all of his offspring to come to him. Never before had I seen such fear in his eyes. As we walked, Dr. Kelly remained mute, a look of growing fear on his face. We sprinted through the house, the three of us. Our search for the dead was swift. Almost all of them were clustered near the entrance hall. To Cassandra. To Sean. Brian's family, his wife and kids, oh God. The crimson. Their physical condition I can't. Something about it keeps replaying in my mind. What was going through their minds? They had expressions on their faces that I will never forget. It was the same for everyone. Constant, unending terror that goes unheard. It was the final sensation they'd have before their assailant arrived. The entrance door was wide open past the dead bodies. Bloody tracks led us to the door. Wherever it went after that, though. Just saying. What I can say with any certainty is that whatever was imprisoned in those grottos, it was not intended to escape.